One of the most important value adds that StoragePoint provides is the ability to drastically shorten the time it takes to actually run a backup. So this session, we will address how StoragePoint already integrates with your existing backup strategy and already safely improves the time it takes to actually take a backup and even perform a recovery. Well, the good news is that the steps that you take today and the strategy that you currently use to protect SharePoint do not change once StoragePoint is actually introduced. So yeah, okay, that will conclude our session then. No, of course, I'm kidding. So today I really want to just discuss the different ways that you are already taking your backups and what you need to do to ensure that you're fully protected within StoragePoint itself. So how do you take your backups today? Well, looking at option number 1, if you are taking backups via SharePoint or PowerShell, external blobs will actually be included in your backups and within your exports and imports. So there's absolutely no difference for you for if the blobs are externalized or not in this case. Because SharePoint is actually aware of the StoragePoint RBS provider, blobs are actually automatically retrieved from external storage during the backup process in these scenarios. And actually, as a side note, that is really true for all PowerShell commands, so you can still seamlessly use PowerShell across the board when StoragePoint is in place. Number 2 there, if you are using SQL backups, your backups will be a little different, but no worries, in a very, very good way. As we said before, you will gain faster backups, and one of the ways that you're going to do that is by introducing StoragePoint with and not even changing your backup strategy. So actually there is no change in the steps that you have to take today when you are using SQL backups. All you need to know is that the blobs that once lived within your database are no longer going to be included in these backups once they've been externalized. Your backups will now only contain the metadata references that are left behind in your database. Now don't worry, it's a good thing, and we'll get to why here in a second. And the same goes for that third option there for third-party database backup tools that you're using maybe from another vendor as well. Unless the product you're using actually has a SharePoint plugin that performs a granular crawl of data using the SharePoint API, blobs will not be included in your backups. So one of those example of those granular crawls is that it basically just has to use the SharePoint API. The SharePoint API itself, when it's called, will make a call to retrieve the file that it's trying to back up, and it will, by the pure nature of the backup process, basically ingest that blob within the backup itself, much in the same way and much for the same reason that the SharePoint and PowerShell commands back up the blob, and the export-import commands contain the externalized blobs as well. The SharePoint API is basically aware of the StoragePoint RBS provider, and it will automatically retrieve externalized blobs as files are requested by the SharePoint API. So you're probably asking yourself how it's a good thing that critical data is no longer included in your SQL backup process. Come on, Steve, I thought you were going to tell me that we didn't have to change our existing backup and our existing recovery strategy. Well, those are fair questions, fair concerns, so let's get to explaining what StoragePoint does to help here. Well, now that blobs no longer live in SQL Server, they will simply not be included in your database backups at all. And again, this is a positive because it'll have a positive effect on both the time it takes for you to perform a backup and the time it takes for you to perform a recovery to mount that database. And StoragePoint will have you covered by taking 2 actions. The first one that I want to go over here is StoragePoint's continuous blob backup process. Basically, as new blobs are created by SharePoint and externalized to your primary endpoint by StoragePoint, a copy of these blobs will also be sent to what is called a backup endpoint. If blobs in your primary endpoint then become either, let's say, missing, corrupted or have any kind of mismatch with the actual blob's reference within SQL Server, StoragePoint will automatically go out and say, okay, this blob is either missing or is trash, and we'll go ahead and restore that blob from this backup endpoint. So it is a key part of any strategy, no matter what product you're using, whether it's from a third party, whether it's from Metalogix, or whether you're going to continue to use your SQL Server and SharePoint backups. You need to have this StoragePoint backup backup endpoint put in place here. Let me actually switch gears and show you what that looks like within StoragePoint itself. So go down to your Central Admin Applications Management section here, and just quickly go to StoragePoint Profiles. Click within a profile. I've just got a couple examples here, so I'll click on one of mine and go down to your little accordion style setup here and go to the Backup Settings section. Scroll down just a bit until you see the backup settings and the schedule that you want to create that backup setting, that continuous blob backup job with. So in my case, I already have a couple backup endpoints that I've got created. If you don't have a backup endpoint, go ahead and create a brand new endpoint directly from this UI, and we'll take you to our interface to actually create a new endpoint. Creating a backup endpoint is going to be the same process as creating a primary endpoint. The only difference here is actually you can see that we will retain the blobs, the unused blobs, for 180 days within the backup endpoint. By default, you'll have the job scheduled as often as every 15 minutes here. I suggest not changing that unless you have any kind of resource issues on your server, but try to continually run this backup job as often as you possibly can. Again, it will take a copy of all the blobs that have been added to the primary endpoint since the last time the actual job ran, and we will have one copy for every single blob that lives in the primary endpoint. One note here as well, a alternative to using our built-in blob backup, our continuous blob backup, is simply to replicate blob stores to a secondary location, and this can be done in any manner. We have many clients where there are many name brand servers that actually provide this kind of replication. There are some of our partners that provide storage devices like EMC and Hitachi have built-in bidirectional replication. That means if a blob exists in maybe your primary endpoint but doesn't exist in your backup endpoint, it'll automatically replicate in real time, and vice versa as well. If a blob exists in the backup endpoint but doesn't exist in your primary endpoint, it'll actually replicate backwards to your primary endpoint as well. So there are some cool ways that we do integrate with EMC and Hitachi devices that really allow you a next level of protection, where it's not only creating the replicated blob for you, but it's doing automatic bidirectional replication and copying the blob back and forth in real time, so you never have to actually think about a blob missing, and StoragePoint actually doesn't have to worry about it either. The device itself is actually doing the replication for us. Okay, well, let's get back to our slide deck here. Move on to another important feature set that we want to talk about that allows you to really perform your existing SQL disaster recovery strategy. So it's taking it a step further. It's not just talking about keeping a backup copy of all your blobs, but now what happens when you have to restore an entire database? And you're going to continue to use your SQL backup strategy as you either take SQL backups and also perform SQL mounts and attaching to SharePoint. So one of the things that you have to talk about when we discuss anything to do with disaster recovery is this feature that I actually just pointed to, which is retaining of unused blobs. I showed you the backup retaining unused blobs feature, but actually both your primary and your backup endpoint will have a setting called retaining unused blobs. Now, unused blobs are just blobs that have actually been deleted from SharePoint, and their associated blob files then get marked for deletion within StoragePoint. So once your end users go ahead and delete something from SharePoint, we will go ahead and actually mark that blob on the back end storage for deletion. We won't delete it right away. And that's key. We are not going to delete it right away, you'll still see it in that endpoint. And by default, we'll have those around for 30 days in the primary endpoint, and then we'll retain the unused blobs like you already saw for 180 days in the backup endpoint. Now again, these settings are hugely important for disaster recovery scenarios. Remember that blobs are not going to be in the backups taken by SQL anymore. So when you need to when you need to restore an entire database, you need to make sure that the blobs that are referenced in that database still actually exist in your primary or in your backup endpoint. Now that's key. Once the backup database is actually mounted and attached to SharePoint, StoragePoint, its only job is to do something very simple. Whenever somebody requests a file, it's going to go out and check if that blob exists in the primary or backup endpoint. And if it does, it'll go retrieve that file for your end user and display that file as if it were as if nothing had happened. So let's say you go ahead and actually mount a database backup. All that you need to ensure is that its associated blob files within that database backup already exist in the primary or the backup endpoint. That means when you're planning for this scenario, you need to make sure that externalized blobs will exist for any database backup that can possibly get restored. Meaning if you retain backups for 45 days, you should retain unused blobs for 45 days, because if you take your oldest backup from 45 days ago and you mount that SQL server, you want to ensure that those blobs that were there 45 days ago that are no longer even used by SharePoint are actually still there as well, because you're about to restore a database that thinks those blobs still exist. All right, let's go back to StoragePoint, and I will show you very quickly, also within the profile, where the settings for retaining unused blobs are. You can see directly in the profile's primary endpoint, we will retain blobs for unused blobs for 30 days. Again, it's all configurable. Just go ahead and change that and go back down to your backup endpoint settings, and you will see the setting for retaining unused blobs for your backup endpoint. The only other piece that you need to think about when you are performing some kind of disaster recovery scenario with a SQL Server backup is if you've restored a SQL Server backup when StoragePoint was configured differently, you will also need to restore StoragePoint's configuration database. So if StoragePoint's, let's say, endpoint or profile configuration has changed since that backup was taken, you'll actually need to restore that database that StoragePoint has there, the StoragePoint config database. It's important because it not only contains tracking information for where your blobs exist, but it will contain all of the details around where your profile endpoints are and what your configuration of that profile and endpoint actually is. So you don't have to actually redo or rebuild anything in the process. Just go ahead and restore that config table. Another important note here that a lot of people always ask me is, well, what if I don't have that configuration table and I just need to do some rebuilding? What happens to all of the tracking information that StoragePoint uses to track where blobs are located? Well, the good news is that if you actually look at your databases themselves now, once StoragePoint is installed, tracking tables also exist within each of your content databases themselves as well. So you have sort of a double failure point there in case you no longer have your StoragePoint configuration database, or you made a mistake and you didn't include the StoragePoint config database in your backups at all. We will have them in tables within each of your content databases. That way you can independently restore a database, maybe to maybe as an unattached mount, and you can actually within any kind of process that looks for restores within maybe SharePoint, we'll actually know where those blobs are located externally because the tracking tables also live within SharePoint's content databases. Okay, so again, let's go back to PowerPoint here. That is really how StoragePoint is built to protect your blobs that are not included in SQL backups any longer. Again, the advantage that this provides is that you get a much faster backup as well as getting a much faster mounting time for any kind of recovery and disaster recovery process here. The key is that as your content grows, and I'm assuming it's going to continue to grow, your backups are just going to take longer and longer, right? Extending what is called your recovery point objective, or your RPO. So this is a good graphic just to remind you why this is a great advantage that StoragePoint provides. Your RPO, just for those who don't know, is the point in time that you can recover from. It's essentially determined by how often you can complete a backup job. So the faster your backup, the more often you can take a backup, and the smaller your RPO then becomes. And now that your database is 95% smaller, we only have to back up that 5% that is left. This, of course, will leave you with a drastically faster backup and that faster recovery amount that I was talking about previously. It's only 5% of the size that it previously was. So from a recovery standpoint, again, we haven't talked too much about recovery. Mounting a much smaller database is far easier, far less error prone, and of course far faster than mounting a potentially large database that not only takes up more space, but can potentially cause errors during the mounting process, because as we all know, SQL Server and SharePoint necessarily don't play very nicely once you get over some of those large 200 gigabyte databases, or even if a site collection itself is larger than 100 gigabytes. So I hope that makes sense, and you can see a nice infographic here about maybe if you have a 1 terabyte database, how quickly your RPO comes down, because that 1 terabyte database now no longer is very large. It's 95% smaller. Now that you know the reason why StoragePoint gives you a faster backup, it's important to understand how, and how that can safely occur. It all actually comes down to the fact, for one simple fact, is that it all comes down to the one simple fact that blobs are immutable. This means that they are never updated. They are only created and only deleted. So as you edit files in SharePoint, SharePoint actually is creating new blobs that contain your changes. Behind the scenes, there actually is a difference in the way SharePoint 2013 and 2016 do this because of shredded storage. It's actually a whole other topic that we do discuss in many other sessions, many other webinars. But all that you need to know is, no matter what, as you make edits and as you make changes to your files within SharePoint, entirely new blobs are created for those changes that contain those changes. The reason why their immutability is important is because if a blob hasn't changed since the last time you backed them up, well, you should be asking yourself, what is the point of backing them up over and over and over again each time we have a backup job? The blobs aren't changing. They're not getting updated. They're not getting edited once that blob file is written to SQL or written to an endpoint externalized by StoragePoint. Immutability is a function of the way SharePoint stores content. This has nothing to really actually do with StoragePoint. StoragePoint is just simply taking advantage of the fact that these blobs are immutable and giving you the continuous backup blob option, so that we always have one copy of that blob. Again, if the blob hasn't changed since the last time you backed them up, and they never will, then why are you backing them up over and over again? You only really need that one copy. As new blobs come in, we'll go ahead and create that one copy for you, so that you have them when you need to restore for any reason, or if the blobs again do get corrupted or do become some kind of size mismatch issue, we will have a copy that we can restore automatically for you. And again, this is the reason why continuous backup provides such great value. It will help you, of course, by not having to take a backup that includes these blobs. So again, you're being proactive by backing up the blobs for you as they're added to SharePoint, and thus, again, we've reduced your backup burden by 95%. And here, you do not need to worry about anything from a disaster recovery standpoint, because we will have the tracking tables included within the content database. Thus you only need to back up the metadata that is left in SQL Server. And of course, as you know, this is going to significantly reduce your backup time as well as your mount time for recovery. This allows you to meet any real RPO and any RTO that you have within SharePoint, no matter how large your farm gets, StoragePoint is going to be a huge value add to the speed of your backup and to the speed of your recovery.